Hi everyone, I'm Jessica J. Lee, and my talk is titled Countryside Beyond Country. There is a moment in my most recent book, Two Trees Make a Forest, in which I find myself standing in southern Taiwan beneath a tree I do not know. The tree's long leaves hung glossy green, a mere background to their flowers, white and puckered clusters of petals opening to a brush of fine filaments. They looked, I thought, like those fiber optic lamps made of fishing line, with great feathered clusters of pink strands, yellow at their tips, and so lightly fused to the base of the flowers that the slightest disturbance showered the ground in a floral rain. I took a photograph of that tree and its blossoms and fruit and looked it up when I got home. Only then did I learn that this was the tree whose strange fruit, waxy green boxes the size of my fist, was dispersed by sea. Many trees have this in common. Coconuts, for example. Seeds that can stay afloat for a long time as they make their way to a new home. This tree, the Barringtonia, had fruits that could survive for longer than a decade awaiting landfall. I begin with this image because having been invited today at the festival, at a festival dedicated to a poet famous for her nature poetry, to speak about country and city in a post-colonial vein, I immediately thought about the ways plants like the Barringtonia ask me to think beyond borders. It's a tree that is listed as both native and introduced to Taiwan, itself a bizarre sort of in-between, a tree that reminds me how so much of my own thinking about place and land is rooted in things caught between places, beyond borders, things in movement and in flux. It's not lost on me that the ways in which I sought knowledge of the tree are themselves deeply historically rooted. I turned first to botanical references, to a flora of Taiwan, whose entries on plants were generated by way of colonial science, through the romanticized inland voyages of British naturalist adventurers, and through the territorial conquests of Japanese botanists. As a nature writer, I find myself so often reliant on a grammar generated through colonial exchange and extraction. Droste Houshoff, in her poetry, might have found much the same, as she turned to botanical texts to note the names of plants she confronted in life and on the page. In such work, I find myself complicit in a tradition of representing nature that, for many centuries, has been preoccupied with nations, borders, and belonging, though these commitments were so rarely made explicit. How can we unpick these legacies? The theme of the festival, Country, City in Flux, reminds me of The Country and the City, a 1973 text by literary scholar Raymond Williams. It's a text I confronted early in my education, and one that I've continued to read again and again, and differently each time. At its heart, the book is a study of pastoral writing in Britain and the ways it's at odds with the reality on the ground. Williams, famous for both his literary scholarship and socialism, was a cultural materialist. Looking at both books and the reality on the ground, he makes a case for the countryside being intimately tied, both physically but also economically, culturally, and historically, with the city. Somewhere in the middle is a chapter that stands out to me as instructive for our thinking today. In the chapter Pleasing Prospects, Williams writes of the cultural mythology of the British countryside as a rural landscape emptied of rural labor. This is the empty countryside of scenic views, of tourism, and in which our dependence upon the land, and even when we live in the city, is erased. The previous speaker, Uta Ruge, has just outlined the consequences of this bias in her keynote. We might ask in this moment what else our pastoral vision of the countryside is without, or more specifically, whom. The question of who belongs to and who gives voice to the countryside is relevant for all who've been subject to an aesthetic order in which this idealized Arcadian pastoral is seen as a marker for beauty. I can put this in simpler terms. I grew up in Canada, where the countryside looks much different than Britain or really anywhere in Europe. Where I grew up, the cultural standard for beauty, for quaintness, for the pastoral was imported. An imagined countryside, populated even in children's books, by British animals, by rabbits and badgers wearing coats, by hedgerows and green fields, growing thick with plants that I had never actually seen in real life. That was what I knew of natural beauty. A legacy of empire, perhaps, though as a child I never fully grasped what that meant. Nina Mingya Poles, the New Zealand writer I find myself most often in conversation with, writes of this phenomenon in the Commonwealth and the uncanny moment of getting to know this version of nature firsthand when she moved to Britain. This is the quote. "I walk in awe under the ancient oaks. I collect red-veined leaves and tiny pine cones fallen from alder trees. Wanting to be able to describe things accurately, I learn the names of trees that have featured in the pictures of stories I've read since childhood, but never seen in real life. The words sound almost mythical to me now. Alder, hazel, yew, ash. I look up names of birds commonly found on the heath: siskin, coot, moorhen, redwing, mistlethrush, kestrel. They taste strange to me, like made-up words from English nursery rhymes, foreign compared to the birds I'm used to: tui, pukeko, kaka, ruru, takahi. Here, in the eyes of the observer, two countrysides overlap and tilt, creating friction, but one has been inscribed as a kind of ideal." I was given this same ideal of natural beauty, which Poles describes, though I didn't really know it firsthand. I'm reminded of V.S. Naipaul, who, in an essay on Wordsworth, once asked what readers in the Caribbean might make of a poem about daffodils if they had never seen one. And if this nature from the center of empire is the benchmark for thinking and writing about the countryside, how did those of us from elsewhere make sense of it? And what of the nature where we come from? As both a reader and a writer, I've longed to see a nature writing in which lands beyond these ideals take the focus, where the homelands of migrants, perhaps, are celebrated just the same. When we hear words like migration, globalization, and post-colonial societies, we still think too often of cities. Some may point here to travel writing. This is not the same thing. Perspective and voice matter here. What happens when lands beyond the borders of a colonial power are written by those who are at home in those lands? A writing of these lands not as colonial encounter, like all those botany books I've relied upon. This, I would say, is one task of writers, readers, publishers in this moment. But there's also a case to be made for turning the lens back, in a way, for the outsider to write the idealized with all that their perspective entails. We see this in calls for greater inclusivity in the countryside, in the UK and the US, from the case of the blackbird watcher Christian Cooper to the message of the stage play Black Men Walking. Such calls have been made also here in Germany. We see calls for writers of color to stake their claim to mountain trails, for disabled writers to unpack ableist conventions in quest-based nature narratives. There's a call for nature writing from the city, especially as we increasingly see flourishing biodiversity not in the countryside, but amidst buildings and urban parks. And a reimagining, perhaps, of who the nature writer might be, beyond Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which remains a potent image for those who wish to critique visions of nature as idealized. And of course, we know there are deep, and particularly in English language traditions, under-acknowledged links between nature writing, nation, and fascism. A long legacy of writing in which belonging to the land through generations is seen as vital. So many of the reimaginings of the countryside's representations in art and literature ask how we can broaden this notion of who belongs. I'd like, however, to push us one or two steps further. In 2018, I launched a literary journal called The Willowherb Review, with the intention of creating a space for nature writers of color to assert their presence in a genre that, in the West, has broadly been dominated by white writers. As I developed our calls for submissions and thought through what I'd most like to publish, however, I felt there was an even stronger case to be made about borders. I'm a dual citizen, the child of immigrant parents, themselves the children of immigrants. My husband, like me, is mixed race and an immigrant. Our daughter, born a few months ago, holds 3 passports by birth. I've had the privilege of living across 3 continents in my life, and all of them have become home in a way, simultaneously, not erasing one another, and movement has become more normal to me than standing still. So many spaces of publication and readings of the genre and ways of thinking about nature fail to grasp this reality. To write about home doesn't always mean to write about rootedness, to write about one place at the exclusion of others. In nature writing terms, nature doesn't stop at the edge of one nation's border. And as I've already hinted, our experiences of one countryside can vastly penetrate our experiences of another. Movement, too, isn't always a privilege. We've seen that so very keenly since 2015 and in recent months. And such acknowledgements are vital in thinking through how we write our connections to place, especially in a moment of mass migration, of climate-induced transformation, when our countrysides are especially beginning to look very different from those of previous decades, let alone the ones we see in art and literature. And when the ideal of countrysides in Britain, as I've mentioned, was catalyzed so often by colonial exploitation abroad, the homeland recast as homeland, as a dream world carried forth by colonists as they ventured elsewhere. So in thinking about the arts, about what I would want to commission and to edit, to publish and to read, it was work that captured this fluidity between countrysides, between countries, between languages and literatures. All of which is to say, in our thinking about the countryside, it is vital to think in specifics of this place where a person or a community may be rooted, but to recognize, perhaps as Raymond Williams observed, the ways in which every specific countryside is already entangled with other places. Our other countrysides, other cities, other countries and cultures. Even in this moment, speaking to you virtually from my home in Cambridge, as you stand in Münster, places are entangled. As the title of this festival states, city and country in flux. A fluidity beyond our human worlds. Perhaps that's what I'm asking for. This is something I've known and learned from nature. For many years, I lived in Berlin, where I swam in lakes that marked the border between East and West. In one of them, the border was literal and insistent, marked out in buoys down the middle of the lake. But what about the water that flowed between them? What of the perch, the water milfoil, the algae, and the wind? In Droste Hulshof's poem, Die Elemente, we see such movement, a borderless nature. I'll read from the translation so you don't have to listen to my terrible German. Water, he says, dear wave, breezing so coolly to the beach, you delicate blood of earth, a kindred of the blood of mine. You send your waves, so sheer, which now as a caress do swell through the mother's ample realm, fountain, stream, and pond so smooth. And at my little hut at once I slurp your redeemed goods, and you become my blood, lovely wave, holy flood. And softly splashing, he falls asleep, and the glow of the sea is thrown past rocks, past fields, past grove, and the sea, it draws its lines around the globe, around the boat. Thinking back to the natural world I confronted when writing Two Trees Make a Forest, there was a species of bird I met in a national park on the edge of the city of Tainan. This was a nature park caught between city and country, at the border marked by industry and fisheries. What some might call an edgeland, or the unofficial countryside, to borrow a term from Richard Mabey. In this park, where reservoirs were shared between the wild creatures and the fishermen, the black-faced spoonbill came to overwinter. These are endangered birds, birds whose numbers 2 decades ago dropped to as few as 300, though with recent conservation efforts, their numbers have rebounded into the thousands. I saw them in their winter home, where salt and fresh water mingled in a muddy estuary, but in summer I knew they would return to another kind of borderland, to the demilitarized zone of the Korean Peninsula, the DMZ, where the absence of human intervention has enabled them to thrive. These birds taught me something about borders, about how nature, though we carve it up with edges and names as city or country, is indifferent to such limitations. I think of these spoonbills often when I write. When we tell tales of birds like them, or of bacteria, of plants, of city and countryside, these are always stories of movement. I wish to leave you with some questions to ponder going forward. My work and my talk today have, of course, been strongly influenced by my connections to Britain, but I consider Germany home too. And with that in mind, I'm curious to what extent we might say that German understandings of countryside now call for a similar reimagining with greater acknowledgement of the legacies of German colonial projects. And now, having read back over the work of Droste Hulshoff, among others, might voices of literature's past help us to reimagine the present moment in thinking about the pastoral, not just in art, but on the ground and in very real terms. Thank you so much for having me today. I wish I could have joined you in person, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.